Everyone knows about the Titanic. Everyone knows about the Hindenburg, the Chicago Fire, Pearl Harbor. These are the disasters that made it into the school books, the movies, the collective memory of a nation. But there are others, disasters that killed more people than the Titanic, fires that erased whole towns in an afternoon, floods that swept away thousands of Americans in a matter of minutes, days when hundreds of children died in a single building, and the country wept, and then, somehow, forgot. Why do some catastrophes echo forever while others vanish? Bad timing, bad luck, the wrong kind of victims. Sometimes a bigger story broke the next morning and took all the oxygen in the room. Today, we're going to remember a few of the ones that slipped away. These were real people, real towns, real mornings that started like any other. They deserve better than to be forgotten. Come with me. Let's start with the deadliest natural disaster in American history, and I'd bet most Americans couldn't name it. It wasn't a hurricane you've heard of. It struck a booming coastal city in Texas at the very end of the 19th century, a city that considered itself the jewel of the Gulf. There was no warning system, no satellites, no radar, just a barometer falling and a sky turning the color of a bruise. When the storm came ashore, it brought a wall of water that swept across an island city built barely a few feet above sea level. There was nowhere to run, no high ground, nothing to climb. The death toll has never been precisely known because entire families vanished without anyone left to report them missing. The estimates run into the thousands, more Americans killed in one night than in any other natural disaster before or since. Homes were torn from their foundations and used as battering rams against other homes. Survivors described clinging to floating debris in the dark, listening to people around them let go one by one. In the aftermath, the city did something extraordinary. It raised itself. Thousands of buildings were physically jacked up, and millions of tons of sand were pumped underneath, lifting the entire city several feet higher. They rebuilt, and they built a seawall, and they went on. And yet, ask 10 Americans to name the deadliest disaster in their country's history, and most will guess wrong. That storm killed more people than the Titanic, the Hindenburg, and the Chicago Fire combined. And it's barely a footnote. Now let me tell you about a school. An ordinary school, in an ordinary oil boom town, on an ordinary afternoon in the spring. Classes were nearly over. The children were restless, waiting for the bell, thinking about the weekend. Beneath the building, natural gas had been leaking. It was odorless. At the time, the gas had no additive to give it a smell, so nobody knew. It collected, invisible and silent, in the crawl space under the school, filling it like water fills a basin. A single spark, a switch flipped, an ordinary motion someone had made 1,000 times, and the building lifted off its foundation and came apart. Nearly 300 people died, most of them children, between the ages of 11 and 17. A town of a few thousand lost almost an entire generation in a matter of seconds. Parents came running from the oil fields, still in their work clothes, and dug through the rubble with their bare hands. There weren't enough coffins. They had to be shipped in from other towns. Here's what came of it. The law that requires natural gas to have that rotten egg smell. That distinctive stench you notice immediately when there's a gas leak in your home? That exists because of those children. Every time a family smells gas and gets out of the house alive, that's their legacy, and almost nobody knows it. There's a pattern here you'll start to notice. The disasters we forget are the ones that change the rules quietly. They live on in building codes, in safety standards, in the small print of regulations that nobody reads. The dead are remembered by the laws written in their names, even when their names are gone. Let's talk about a dam. High in the hills above a working-class industrial town, a private club of wealthy men owned a lake for fishing and boating. The earthen dam that held it back was old, poorly maintained, and had been modified in ways that made it weaker, lowered, so a road could run across the top, with the emergency spillways partially blocked by screens to keep the club's expensive fish from escaping. The people in the valley below had joked about it for years. Every heavy rain, someone would say the dam was going to go. It became a punchline. Until the day it wasn't. After days of unprecedented rain, the dam gave way. 20 million tons of water came down that valley, a wall of water carrying trees, boulders, houses, railway cars, and everything else it collected on the way. It hit the town at highway speed. Over 2,000 people died in minutes. Whole families, whole streets. The debris piled up against a stone bridge, and then the debris caught fire, and people trapped in it burned alive while their neighbors watched, unable to reach them. It was, at the time, the worst civilian disaster in American history. It made international news, money poured in from around the world, and no one, not one person from that private club, was ever held legally responsible. The courts found it to be an act of God. Now, a fire in a factory, a garment factory, high in a building in a major American city where mostly young immigrant women worked long hours sewing clothes. Many were teenagers, some were as young as 14. A fire started in a scrap bin. It spread fast through the fabric and the lint, and the workers discovered what management had done. The exit doors were locked from the outside to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks. The single fire escape twisted and collapsed under the weight of the people on it. The fire ladders of that era could not reach the upper floors. And so, the crowds in the street below, thousands of them, stood and watched as young women appeared at the windows, held hands, and jumped. Nearly 150 people died that day, most of them women, most of them young. Out of that horror came the modern workplace. Fire codes, mandatory unlocked exits, sprinkler requirements, the entire architecture of workplace safety law. Every fire exit door you have ever pushed open, every "this door must remain unlocked during business hours" sign, traces directly back to those women at those windows. And this is the thing that gets me. That fire is remembered by labor historians, but ask an ordinary person today and you'll get a blank look. The safety laws survived. The women didn't make it into the culture. Then there are the disasters that vanished because the timing was wrong. There was a steamboat, packed far beyond capacity with newly released Union prisoners of war heading home at the end of the Civil War. Men who had survived the worst prison camps of the war, starved and sick, finally going home to their families. The boat's boilers exploded on the river at night. The ship burned and sank. Around 1,800 men died, more than died on the Titanic. Men who had survived a war, dying within days of home. And the country barely noticed. Because it happened in the same weeks that the president had been assassinated, and the nation's attention was entirely elsewhere, the greatest maritime disaster in American history was buried on the inside pages. The families grieved alone. Sometimes a disaster is forgotten simply because a bigger story stood in front of it. Now consider a whole town that has been burning for over half a century. Beneath a small coal country town, a fire ignited in the coal seams underground, probably from burning trash in an old pit, and it never went out. It spread through the tunnels beneath the town, slowly, invisibly, for years. The ground grew warm. Smoke seeped from cracks in gardens. Carbon monoxide crept into basements. Then, one day, the earth simply opened up beneath a 12-year-old boy in a backyard, and he was nearly swallowed into a smoking pit. He survived by holding onto a tree root while his cousin pulled him out. The town was eventually condemned. Almost everyone left. The buildings were demolished. Today, the streets are still there, cracked, empty, with smoke drifting up from the ground on cold mornings. The fire is expected to burn for another 250 years. A town that died so slowly that no one can say exactly when it ended. And then there are the ones that are almost too big to be remembered properly. A pandemic that killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and tens of millions worldwide within about 2 years. It hit the young and healthy hardest. Cities ran out of coffins and dug mass graves. Schools became morgues. And when it ended, the world did something remarkable and awful. It went quiet about it. Survivors didn't want to talk about it. It was omitted from the histories, skipped in the school books. For decades, it was the forgotten pandemic, hiding in plain sight, until it suddenly became relevant again in our own lifetimes. There's a category of forgotten disaster that almost nobody thinks about at all, the ones that happened underground. Coal mining built industrial America, and it did so on a foundation of dead men. Explosions, cave-ins, floods, poison gas, mine disasters killed thousands upon thousands of Americans, often dozens or hundreds at a time, and they happened with such grim regularity that the newspapers eventually stopped treating them as extraordinary. Picture the scene at the mouth of a mine after an explosion. The whole town gathers because, in a coal town, everyone's husband or father or son is down there. The women stand at the gate in silence, watching the rescue crews go in. And they wait, sometimes for days, as the bodies come up one at a time. In some disasters, an entire town lost nearly every working-age man in a single morning. We remember the coal towns as picturesque. We put them on calendars. We forget that they were, quite literally, built on a body count that would be considered a national emergency today. And then there are the disasters that never got a proper name because the victims didn't count for much in the eyes of the people writing the news. Fires in tenements packed with immigrant families, collapses at construction sites where the workers were poor and easily replaced, explosions in factories and company towns where the company owned the newspaper, the police, and the coroner. There is a whole shadow history of American catastrophe involving people the country considered disposable, and much of it was never written down at all. That's the hardest kind of forgotten. Not forgotten because time passed, forgotten because somebody made sure it was never recorded. Let's also talk about the disasters that happened in the sky, and the peculiar way we let them go. There was a period in the middle of the last century when air travel was new, and crashes were terrifyingly frequent. Two airliners once collided directly over one of the great natural wonders of America, killing everyone aboard both planes and scattering wreckage across a canyon so vast that many victims could not be recovered. That crash horrified the country and led directly to the creation of the modern air traffic control system, the invisible net that keeps thousands of aircraft from occupying the same piece of sky. Every safe flight you have ever taken is downstream of that catastrophe, and almost no one remembers it. There's a strange comfort in that, in a way. The disasters we forget are, very often, the ones we successfully learned from. The lesson got absorbed so completely into how the world works that the tragedy behind it became invisible. That's a kind of victory, even if it's a bitter one. The forgetting is proof that the fix worked. But it's a fragile victory, too, because rules get rolled back, regulations get called burdensome, inspections get skipped. Someone in a boardroom, generations later, looks at a safety requirement, doesn't know where it came from, and asks why they're paying for it. And that's when the whole cycle starts again. The rules are written in blood. When you forget the blood, you start editing the rules. What do we do with all this? Why does it matter to dig these things back up? Because forgetting is how it happens again. Every one of these disasters was preventable. The dam that wasn't maintained, the gas with no smell, the exit doors that were locked, the overloaded boat. Somebody made a decision, or failed to, and the bill came due for people who had no say in it. And here's what strikes me most, going through all of them. In almost every case, the danger was known. People had joked about the dam. Workers had complained about the locked doors. Somebody, somewhere, said, "This is going to end badly," and was ignored, until the day they were right. That's the real lesson buried in these forgotten disasters. Not that the world is dangerous, we know that. It's that we are extremely good at ignoring a warning, right up until the moment it becomes a memorial. So remember them, not out of morbid curiosity, but because those thousands of people were as real as you are. They had breakfast that morning. They had plans for the weekend. And their deaths bought us the rules that keep us alive today. Now I want to hear from you. Is there a disaster near where you live that nobody outside your town remembers? A flood, a fire, a mine collapse, a factory that went up? Tell me in the comments, the place, the year, the story. Because a disaster is only truly forgotten when the last person stops telling it. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and pay attention to the